Welcome to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where Peter Madison and David Shurock discuss the complexities of adopting new ways of working at scale. Hello, Dave. We're back again.
Peter, it is good to chat, good to catch up, and I think we've been having a bit of a conversation beforehand. This is going to be an interesting topic. I don't know where it's going to go, but it's very much of the moment around process improvement and AI agents and how they play nice or don't play nice together.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think you and I were voicing some different perspectives, maybe based on what we've read or seen or done or tried in a variety of different cases, and wondering about like what the right way of of approaching this is and having
Yeah.
this conversation. So why don't you kick us off with like a
Well, the thing that's so we're looking at, as every organization is, we're looking at some of the processes that we have internally and trying to figure out which ones, where is agentic AI going to be able to help us, reduce time, catch, be able to move into different areas because we're getting some of these processes taken care of automatically. And as you start exploring that, it's one of the things that struck me is in order for us to go in and improve a process, one of the first things that we do is map that process. And there's a lot of the things when we're mapping a process, we've done value stream optimization, we've done process mapping in many, many different contexts. The map that you end up with, we talk about this many times, the map is not reality, it's a model of reality and it's missing certain things. And those things that it's missing, I wonder, are actually where we want our AI agents to be operating, but we're not capturing them in that process, in the process map.
Yes, well, because all models are wrong and some are useful, right? It's the
Yeah.
it's that age-old problem that it's an abstraction of the actual underlying system because the underlying system is far more complex than we can possibly build in a model. No matter how many elements we put on it, we're never going to get an entirely accurate model of what the underlying system is doing, if there's humans involved, especially.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I mean, and I'm just thinking of if I just take a recruitment pipeline and there's a step in there that says the subject matter expert might review, or even the HR specialist might review a range of different resumes to evaluate which ones go to the next stage. That process, we can articulate it pretty cleanly as a review process, but we might be able to come up with a list of things that we're reviewing against, like a job description and a few things that we look for a good fit in our organization. But also, I know that if you and I were recruiting for a particular role and reviewed a bunch of resumes together, you and I would agree on a lot of them, but we'd also have some of these standout resumes that would be picked out for other reasons, for some sort of ambiguous kind of experience or feel for where that's going, what that person is trying to communicate in their resume.
yeah, if there's a different piece underlying, like we pull out a particular line because it resonates to us about something that we remember from our experience, that we think, oh, it might be interesting to talk to this person.
And I feel like there are some processes where you don't want that ambiguity, right? You don't want it because that's the whole bit we're trying to get rid of. And yet there are other scenarios where we definitely want that ambiguity, but it's not captured. So we don't necessarily build it into an AI flow.
Yeah, and it's some of it comes down to where the variance is, like how much variance are we willing to tolerate, and if the AIs are introducing that variance, which we might want in some cases, like if we're building something over the top of a system that's changing a lot, then having AI there that so it can interpret that change and decide what action to take could be valuable.
Yeah, well, I mean, it feels to me like, and I love to explore some of this variation, and there's a whole bunch of measures to think about some of those, whatever it might go into, but there are processes that we want to be stable, repetitive, really consistent in how they work. And then there are processes that we actually want that variation because that variation gives us something unusual, new. It gives us something that's on the edges and which gives us value if the value is in the edge.
Yeah, which is it's this fascinating piece, and I think where the real complexity comes in is that a process may be both or might change over time. So,
Yeah.
where do we want to apply these pieces? One of the other bits that when you started from agentic AI, and agentic AI is like one AI feeding into another, into another, into another. Essentially the context engine as it starts
Yep.
to build up the solution. Now, this is and one of the pieces I was reading about this week, which I thought was quite a good observation. That is, from a DevOps perspective, we've typically looked to automate processes and practices for the exact reason to try and reduce sort of the cascading errors that happen if you've got lots of handoffs between inaccurate systems. So the intent is to put automation in place to prevent that. If the automation switches to being AI agents, which are inherently inaccurate, then they're not necessarily the best solution.
Yeah. Now that raises, so in my head, when you're describing DevOps, I'm thinking that's great. I want my invoicing process as an example. We have a contract, there's some sort of payment milestone in there. When we deliver it, we want that invoice to go out. But to your point, I don't want any hallucination around that invoice. I mean, maybe it was in the positive direction, I don't know. But you look at something like that, I find it's really interesting that you're absolutely correct that if I'm looking for something that's consistent, I might truly want to automate it in the sense of let's kind of get some scripts going and just automate that process with very little in fact eliminating the variation in that process. And this is what DevOps did for the whole process of deployment and invoicing. If I look at invoicing and various things like that, I want to eliminate that variation. So maybe those categories of problems aren't suited to AI. Would that be, we're going in the right direction there?
Well, what I wonder is, and I think there's this whole piece around statistical process optimization and variance and staying within certain bounds. And so if something exceeds those bounds, do I take a different action than if it remains within those bounds? So perhaps what we have, maybe, just throwing it out there, if we start to think of AI as a technology and a tool alongside something like cloud to be able to start to solve problems in different ways, if we have a process that under normal circumstances behaves the way that it's intended to behave and solves problems because it's a static process which will behave within these bounds. If it runs into a problem where it can no longer figure out what it is to do, rather than waking up Bob at 3 o'clock in the morning, it calls out to the AI and says, hey, can you help me solve this?
Yeah, I like where you're going there, partially because I don't like the idea that the sort of those categories of processes are not suited to looking at AI. I think AI approach, and we're kind of conflating lots of different ways of using AI. But if I look at the automation that comes in around some of those processes, I think you absolutely do want a little bit of that thought process behind it. And it's that, putting the bounds in, understanding the boundaries within which I don't want the agents to be overthinking it versus the boundaries in which I do want them to think around things becomes quite interesting.
Yes, yeah. And that maybe there's something there where it starts to rethink what the different processes look like. And there's nothing to say you couldn't use AI to help you design that first process. But maybe once it's designed, I don't need to go and reinvent the wheel. I want it to behave like this every single time. I don't want it to suddenly hallucinate and go and start making paper clips. Right?
I have no idea how paper clips come into your process improvement conversations. But it's one of the other things that just jumps to mind is I was just reading Ethan Mollick's blog post this morning around the bitter lesson of actually, because we talk about process and capturing that and then informing some agents to be able to follow through on it. And the bitter lesson that Ethan Mollick was talking about is that what actually works better if you just get out of the way and have that agentic AI stack really look at the entire process and model it towards a given outcome. And then it'll come out probably with a better understanding of the process or a better implementation of that process than anything that you or I could have assessed and created a process map for with a bunch of decision trees in it, which is the natural way that we might look.
Yeah, and that too is an interesting way. If you can get sufficient data which is where you started around like the missing parts of what some of that assessments is. Yes, the AI is going to be able to design a better version of this than us potentially, because it's going to pick up on a lot of those things, right? It's going to be able to pull in a lot of information and create the sort of the logic chain that's needed with the right structure and prompting and other pieces that went into that.
That one's, I feel like we're on the edge of a precipice now. I'm not sure how much further the conversation is going to go without us really stretching out over areas that I don't know that I fully understand. Perhaps
it's an interesting there's not just a conceptual idea. I mean, you can see people doing this, and there's definitely work that occurs that is not necessarily easily capturable into a set of AI processes. There's also the sort of snowflake problem that everybody believes that what they do is unique. And so the AI
Yes.
may have
Yeah.
already seen this elsewhere anyway. So it can build up a model based on observations elsewhere of how that might have been done
Yeah.
somewhere else. As long as it doesn't hallucinate some crazy thing or misinterpret an acronym somewhere, because your taxonomy for your company may be different internally to what it is in the general marketplace, and all sorts of other fun things like that. So there's a lot of training and logic, but these are all problems you can overcome, but they're just things that take time to work through. And so I think there is that piece of, you don't just string a bunch of these pieces together and just fire them raw at a business problem and not expect problems. There's lots of things that have to happen to make that work.
One thing that jumps to mind when you're describing it that way, and this is something that again is a feeling. I don't have a deep data set to look at this on, but certainly one of the things that I find since marketing has been really like taken off in the sense of so many of the posts that you and I are reading, looking at, come across in many cases will be AI derived. And my sort of interpretation of that, if you like, is that it's a move towards a common center as you're going. It's sort of I always think of it as a regression to a mean in terms of messaging and so on. And and it's exactly that difference. I want that around, say, invoice processes and DevOps. I don't want that variation. But I wonder if we don't actually want some of that ambiguity to come through in many of those. So if I think of the most powerful marketing messages that we've seen in the years that we've been exposed to them, the ones that stand out and resonate are unusual in some pretty significant way. There's a juxtaposition there that is not a mean interpretation of whatever it is that they're advertising, but is actually something unusual that catches the eye, catches the mind in some way.
Yeah, the advertising campaigns that stick in your head, and you remember, Pepsi versus Coke or something like that. Although
I was just going to say, now I'm not using that to reel off some of the advertising campaigns that are stuck in my mind. If nothing else, you'll find they're mostly beer campaigns. But
like the "What's up," for example. Well, I remember the advert way more than I like the beer.
Yes. So, but how do we kind of pull this together or wrap it up in some sort of succinct, pragmatic learnings from our conversation here?
So I think a couple of the really interesting pieces that we touched on around process improvement and agentic AI. So there is a lot of ways in which AI can help you improve your processes in your organization without a shadow of a doubt. I think we've expressed some interest in how best to apply that in a cascading way where you've got agentic AI and AI quiz feeding into each other, how that might work effectively in certain types of processes where you want to reduce the amount of variability, not increase it. And you may have a process that's pretty much has very little variability because you've automated a lot of it. Introducing AI directly into that may cause more problems than it solves potentially. But it partly will also depend on what are the underlying systems being managed and monitored and where are the variance points. And there's a lot of ifs in that. But I think that's one of the key nuggets that we're talking about is thinking about like not all processes are equal. It's definitely
I really like that idea of it. It's an it depends response, which is go look at your processes and start categorizing. Are these ones? And I think DevOps is a great example. There's loads of work went into DevOps. Much of that work was about eliminating variation in processes and getting to the point where it was consistent, repeatable, really stable, robust ways of deploying basically features and so on. And I see that category of processes. There are also other categories of process. We talked a little bit about the marketing ones, some marketing messages at least, where we might actually want to explore the edges rather than get into this sort of consistent, stable, repeatable center. So understanding the types of processes at least begins on defining how we might approach it. And then I point to everything that you were talking about, the variability, which is, how do you really explore that? How do you capture it? Again, I think like process mapping, we don't really think about the variability necessarily.
Well, it's kind of interesting, right? Because it's and we're sort of drifting off summarizing things here, right?
Yes, we're going back again.
Because AI is perfectly capable of ensuring that you get the right responses. It's just the part of you can't always rely on it do so, just as you wouldn't rely on having the human be the one who's sitting there doing that. You would have the computer system do it. What you want the AI to do is say, I'm not going to be able to answer this. I'm going to send it to the computer.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what it would do. If it sees that your intent is to solve a math problem, it will call a math library, programming library, and solve it that way. and so you need it to behave in that manner, and it will generally. I think that's a reasonable summation.
I think we've brought in enough ambiguity into our conversation here to show that this isn't AI generated, I think is the takeaway from that.
I hope our listeners find this valuable, and it's a fascinating topic. I'm always happy to have it. If anybody would like to reach out, they can at feedback@definitelymaybeagile.com. And look forward to next time, Dave.
Peter, until next time, thanks again.
You've been listening to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where your hosts, Pete Madison and David Sharrock, focus on the art and science of digital, agile, and DevOps at scale.